All right, let's dive in with a little thought experiment for you, our resident philosopher.
Mm.
Imagine trying to figure out right now what you'll be sipping on next Tuesday, coffee or tea.
Ooh, tough call.
Right, feels wide open, doesn't it? But let's make it a bit more philosophical. Can we actually say whether the statement, quote, the learner will have coffee next Tuesday, end quote, is true or false today?
Now, that's a head-scratcher. And that, my friend, is precisely why future contingents have been a philosophical enigma for, well, ages.
They really have. And that's exactly what we're tackling in this deep dive, especially for you, the learner, who, as we know, loves to grasp things quickly, thoroughly, and from all angles. And speaking of angles, you led us to a gold mine of information with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, you guessed it, future contingents.
Oh, it's a treasure trove. And, for a philosopher like yourself, it lays out the arguments and the historical context in a way that's both, well, comprehensive and digestible.
Absolutely. So today, we're setting out to explore this, let's be honest, pretty complex terrain. We're going to unpack how philosophers have grappled with this idea of whether we can actually say something that might happen in the future, a future contingent, is already true or false today.
Exactly. And, we're aiming for those aha moments as we uncover some of the, well, sometimes mind-bending implications. Think centuries of debate, intricate logical systems, thought experiments that might just reshape your perception of time.
Don't worry, though. We'll guide you through it all, making sure you leave with a solid understanding without getting lost in the philosophical jargon.
But first, let's be crystal clear about what exactly we're focusing on. We're talking about those statements about the future that genuinely could go either way. These future contingents, as they're called, they're the ones causing all the philosophical friction.
Like Aristotle's classic example. Will there be a sea battle tomorrow? Or will there not be? Can we say for sure today which one is true?
It's a puzzle, isn't it? Or think about it from a theological perspective. God's supposed knowledge of our future choices. Does that knowledge make our choices any less free, any less contingent? It's a fascinating question.
It is. And that brings us to the central questions we're going to be wrestling with today, straight from your source material. If the future isn't fixed, can a statement about it actually be true or false now?
If it can, what makes it so?
And if it can't, then how do we get around this seemingly strained conclusion that neither of the possible outcomes will actually occur?
It's a real philosophical tightrope walk, even for seasoned thinkers.
It is. So let's get right to the heart of it, the core problem. How are these future contingent statements different from, say, something like, it's raining right now, or Napoleon lost at Waterloo? The article points out that the truth of those present and past statements seems pretty straightforward, pretty connected to what is or was actually real.
But with future contingents, the reality that would make them true or false, well, that's still up in the air. It's like trying to judge a race before the runners even take off.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So to say a future contingent is definitely true or false today, we'd have to assume that the future is already decided, right? Which kind of goes against the whole idea of contingency, of things being able to go different ways.
Exactly. It's like trying to get a clear answer about something that's inherently unclear.
So that brings us to, according to the article, two main challenges. First, we have to address this idea of logical determinism, the view that actually there aren't any real future contingents because everything that will happen is already, destined to happen.
Right. If you buy into that, then any statement about the future is already set in stone, either true or false. It throws contingency right out the window.
And then the second challenge is for those who do believe in an open future, how do they come up with a theory of truth that fits with that picture? How can something that's genuinely uncertain today still have a definite truth value now? So those are some pretty big questions.
They are.
Can we even really say it will rain tomorrow and mean that it's true or false today? And if we can, what makes it true or false? Or maybe our talk about the future just doesn't work that way.
Those are the questions that have fueled centuries of philosophical debate. It's a real tug of war between our sense of an open future and our need to make meaningful statements about it.
Right. And speaking of centuries of debate, that leads us nicely to the historical roots of this whole issue. The article takes us way back to Aristotle and on interpretation specifically, his famous sea battle example.
Yes. Aristotle basically said, look, we've got these two statements. Tomorrow there will be a sea battle, and tomorrow there will not be a sea battle. Now, if one of these is true today, doesn't that mean the future is already decided?
So already we're hitting that snag about contingency, right?
Exactly. But then he goes on to say, well, if neither statement is true today, how can one of them become true tomorrow without something making it true beforehand? It's a classic philosophical dilemma. How do we square the idea of a fixed truth with a future that's still up in the air?
It's a good one, that's for sure. And then we have Diodorus Cronus and his master argument, which seems like a pretty hardcore attempt to tackle this.
Oh, it was ambitious, no doubt. Diodorus said, look, these three ideas can't all be true at the same time. First, that everything true about the past is set in stone, necessary. Second, that you can't get an impossible conclusion from a possible premise. And third, that there are things that are possible but will never actually happen.
So he's saying that something has to give, right?
You're right. And he used the first two ideas, which seem pretty reasonable, to argue against the third one, which basically says that some possibilities might never come true.
So he leans towards determinism then.
He does. He ends up saying that if something's possible, it's guaranteed to happen eventually. So he's arguing for a kind of necessity, even for events that seem like they could go either way. It's a fascinating exploration of how our intuitions about possibility can clash with the strict rules of logic.
It is. And then shifting gears a bit, we get to the medieval period and the problem of divine foreknowledge. How did that get tangled up with the whole future contingents issue?
Well, imagine a being like God who knows everything that's going to happen, including all our future choices. Doesn't that make it seem like those choices are already determined even before we make them? And then how can we talk about free will if God already knows what we're going to do?
Right, because if it's already known, it's not really a choice, is it?
Exactly. And that's where the theological debate starts to look a lot like the philosophical debate about future contingents. They both wrestle with the same basic question. Does knowing something about the future make that future inevitable?
And that leads us to Lavenham's summary of different scholastic approaches from around 1380. What were the main reactions he outlined?
So Lavenham starts with this argument that seems to say that if God knows the future, then the future has to be fixed. Then he lays out 4 possible ways to respond to that. And while his framing was theological, these responses actually have broader implications for how we might think about any kind of foreknowledge, even without bringing God into the picture.
So let's unpack those reactions for our philosophical listeners.
All right. The first reaction was basically, okay, you win. If God knows the future, then there's no such thing as a truly open future. That's essentially accepting determinism.
So no free will, no contingency, everything's preordained.
Right. But then the second reaction was to challenge a key part of that initial argument. It said, hold on, just because something will happen doesn't mean it was always destined to happen. So this challenges the idea that future truths are somehow fixed beforehand.
Okay, so a bit more wiggle room there.
A bit. The third reaction went even further. It said, maybe for some future events, it's just not true or false yet whether they'll happen. We can't apply the law of excluded middle here.
So rejecting a fundamental principle of logic, eh? Bold move.
Definitely. And then the fourth option was to say, maybe the past isn't as set in stone as we think. Maybe it doesn't have to lead to a single fixed future.
And what did Lavenham himself think?
Well, he actually favored that fourth option, rejecting the idea that the past completely determines the future. He followed Occam's thinking on this.
Interesting. But how do you even deny the necessity of the past? What's happened has happened, right?
Right. But the key here is this medieval idea of the true future. Think of it like this. The past has definitely happened, but what would happen in the future wasn't necessarily a fixed part of that past until it actually became the present.
So the past kind of sets the stage, but there's still multiple possible futures that could unfold from it.
Exactly. God's knowledge, or any kind of foreknowledge, might pick out the true future, but that doesn't mean that future was always a necessary outcome of the past. It's like a branching path, where the past is the shared starting point, but the future could go in different directions.
I'm starting to see the appeal of that view. And then we have Molina's middle knowledge idea, which seems to build on this.
Right. Molina said that God knows what each free agent would choose in any given situation. It's a way of explaining how God can know future contingents without actually determining them.
So God knows the possibilities, but doesn't force the outcome.
Precisely. It's a nuanced way of reconciling divine knowledge with free will.
Okay, so moving from the medieval period to the more, let's say, formal side of things, the article talks about A.N. Pryor and his work in temporal logic.
Ah, Pryor. He was a real pioneer. He essentially invented modern tense logic by giving us a way to talk about time using logical symbols. He introduced operators like P for it has been the case that, and F for it will be the case that. He even formalized tomorrow and yesterday.
So he gave us a precise language to analyze statements about time, past, present, and future, including those tricky future contingents.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that he used this formal logic to reconstruct those classic arguments for determinism that we talked about earlier. He identified 5 key principles that, when you put them together, lead to the conclusion that if something will happen, it's already necessary that it will happen.
So he was able to show how those seemingly intuitive ideas about time and truth actually lead to determinism.
Precisely. And once he laid those principles out in this clear, logical way, he could start to play around with them, see what happens if you tweak or reject certain ones. And he actually came up with 2 systems of tense logic that specifically aimed to avoid determinism. One was called the Pearson system, and the other was the Alchemist system.
Clever names. So he was offering different logical frameworks for thinking about future contingents in a way that preserved the possibility of an open future.
Exactly. It was a major step forward in the philosophical debate. He also discussed Ukasiewicz's earlier work with 3 valued semantics, which basically said, we need a third truth value besides true and false to deal with future contingents.
Makes sense? If it's not yet determined, it's not exactly true or false yet.
Right. And then the article brings in this idea of branching time semantics, which Kripke suggested in a letter to Pryor.
Oh, this is where time gets really interesting, visually speaking at least.
It does. Instead of thinking of time as a straight line, Kripke said, what if it's more like a tree? The present moment is the trunk, and as we move towards the future, time branches out into all the different ways things could go.
So at any given moment, there isn't just one future waiting to happen, but a whole bunch of potential futures.
Precisely. And each of those branches represents a possible history, a chronicle as it's called. And importantly, we usually think of the past as linear, no branching backwards. What's happened has happened, and it's the same for all those future possibilities.
Right, so the past is fixed, but the future is open.
Exactly. And this branching time model gives us a really helpful way to think about the truth of future contingent statements, because now we can evaluate them not just relative to a specific moment in time, but also relative to a specific branch of the future.
So a statement might be true on one branch, but false on another.
Exactly. And that leads us to the different solutions philosophers have come up with, solutions that actually challenge that fundamental law of excluded middle, that something has to be either true or false.
Right. The first one the article mentions is Ukasiewicz's 3 valued semantics. How does that work?
Well, Ukasiewicz basically said, look, to deal with future contingents, we need a third truth value. Let's call it undetermined. So a statement like, there will be a sea battle tomorrow would be neither true nor false today, but undetermined, because we don't know yet which way it's going to go.
So acknowledging the uncertainty, acknowledging that it's not yet decided.
Exactly. But this leads to some interesting consequences. For example, in his system, if you combine 2 undetermined statements with or, the result is still undetermined.
Which seems a bit odd, right? Because even though we don't know whether there will or won't be a sea battle, it seems like it has to be one or the other.
Right. And Pryor pointed that out. He said, even if we don't know which one is true, it still seems true that either there will be a sea battle or there won't be.
So Ukasiewicz's system kind of clashes with our intuition there. What about Pryor's pure scene solution? How did that handle future excluded middle?
Pryor's approach was interesting. He said, okay, let's say a statement about the future is true at a certain moment, only if it's true in all the possible future branches that come from that moment.
So unless something is guaranteed to happen in every possible future, it's false.
Yeah, basically. And since most future contingents could go either way, they would be considered false in this system. So the statement, either there will be a sea battle tomorrow or there won't be, would also be false because neither outcome is guaranteed in all possible futures.
But doesn't that mean most of our everyday predictions about the future are just wrong?
Well, in a way, Pryor was coming at this from a very strong belief in free will. He argued that if a choice is truly free, then it's not settled until the choice is made, so any statement predicting the choice beforehand has to be false.
I see the logic, but it's definitely a counterintuitive view.
It is, and there are some philosophical challenges to it. For example, it doesn't really capture how we usually talk about the future. We say things like, it might rain tomorrow, without meaning that it has to rain in every single possible scenario.
Right. We're usually thinking about a single future that's still unfolding, not all the possible ones at the same time.
Exactly. And that's where some other solutions come in, solutions that try to keep the law of excluded middle, but challenge the idea that the past completely determines the future.
Like Pryor's Alchemist solution.
Exactly. This system says, look, we can still say that for any future event, it will either happen or it won't happen. But let's reconsider how the past relates to the future.
So how does it do that?
Well, in the Alchemist model, the truth of a statement depends on both the moment in time and the specific branch of the future you're considering. So a statement like, tomorrow it will rain, is true at a certain moment if it's true on the branch of the future where it does indeed rain tomorrow. And it's possible if it's true on at least one of those branches.
So it's about whether the statement holds true in a particular possible future, not whether it holds true in all possible futures.
Precisely. And that allows future contingent statements to be either true or false without requiring them to be true or false in every possible scenario.
And what about the past? How does that fit in?
Well, the Alchemist view makes a distinction between hard facts about the past and soft facts about the past.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain that one.
A hard fact is something like, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. It's settled no matter what happens afterward.
Right. Can't argue with that.
But a soft fact is a statement about the past that refers to the future. Like, yesterday, it was true that I would drink coffee today. The truth of that statement yesterday actually depends on whether I actually drink coffee today.
So even though it's about the past, its truth depends on something in the future.
Right. And that means it's not a hard fact in the same way. And that's how the Alchemist system gets around the idea that the past completely dictates the future.
So it's a more nuanced view of the past, allowing for more openness in the future.
Exactly.
The article also mentions the Leibnizian theory as another way to approach this.
Yes. The Leibnizian view is a bit different. It sees all the possible histories, not so much as branches coming from a shared past, but more like parallel timelines that might overlap for a while but then go their separate ways.
So more like separate universes with their own unique histories?
Kind of. And in this view, the truth of a statement depends on the specific timeline you're looking at.
Okay, so a statement could be true in one timeline, but false in another.
Exactly. And this also helps to loosen the grip of the past on the future.
Interesting. And then we have the true futurist theory, with that striking image of the thin red line.
Ah, yes. This theory says that out of all those possible futures, there's one that's the real one, the one that will actually happen, and that's the thin red line.
So all the other futures are just possibilities, but this one is the actual destined future.
That's the idea. And the truth of a statement depends on whether it's true on that thin red line future.
But how do you even know which one is the thin red line?
Well, that's where things get tricky. Philosophers have tried to come up with rules for how this thin red line function works, but it's led to some logical headaches.
It seems like trying to pinpoint a single fixed future within all those possibilities might be a bit of a philosophical trap.
It might be, and some philosophers have argued that it's not even compatible with the idea of a genuinely open future. If there are multiple real possibilities, how can one be the only real one?
Good point. So what about the supervaluationist theory? How does that deal with all this?
Supervaluationism says, okay, let's evaluate truth based on what happens in all the possible futures. So, if a statement is true in every possible future, it's true. If it's false in every possible future, it's false.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward.
But here's the twist. If a statement is true in some futures and false in others, then it's neither true nor false.
So there are truth-value gaps.
Right, and this allows supervaluationism to accept the law of excluded middle, that something has to be either true or false, but only in a way that applies to all possible futures, not just a single one.
I'm seeing how this avoids picking a true future, but also avoids saying that nothing about the future is true or false yet.
Exactly, but it does lead to some strange consequences for logic. For example, you could have two statements about the future, neither of which is definitely true yet, but the statement, either this will happen or that will happen, could still be true.
Because in every possible future, one of them will eventually be true.
Exactly. So logic gets a bit weird in this system.
Definitely a trade-off. And finally, we have Macfarlane's relativist theory.
Right. Macfarlane says that the truth of a statement depends not only on when it's said, but also on when it's evaluated. So, a statement about the future might not be definitively true or false when you say it, but it can become true or false later when we see how things actually turn out.
So the truth of a future contingent statement kind of crystallizes as the future unfolds.
Exactly. And this view also allows for truth-value gaps. So, it will rain tomorrow, might not be true or false today, but it will definitely be one or the other tomorrow, depending on the weather.
It's almost like the truth is relative to your position in time.
In a way, it is.
Wow, this has been quite the philosophical journey. We've covered so much ground, from Aristotle's sea battle to all these complex systems of temporal logic.
And it all started with a simple question.
Mhm.
Can we say whether a statement about the future is true or false today?
And as we've seen, that question opens up a whole universe of philosophical debate.
It really does. We've seen how different philosophers have tried to reconcile the idea of an open future with our desire to make meaningful statements about what might happen. Some say future possibilities don't have a truth value yet. Others say only what's necessary is true. And still others say the truth depends on which future actually comes to pass.
And we've seen how these debates have evolved over centuries, from the medieval period to the present day.
It's a testament to the enduring power of these questions.
It is. So, thinking back to our coffee or tea thought experiment, how do you feel about that statement now? Does it seem any clearer whether it's true or false today?
After this deep dive, it probably seems even more complex than before, right?
Probably, but hopefully also more fascinating. And the debate is far from over. Philosophers are still exploring these ideas, using logic, physics, and even ideas from other fields to try to get a clearer picture of how time and truth really work.
It's a journey with no end in sight, and it's one that every philosopher can join.
Exactly. So what stands out to you after this exploration? What questions are you left with? What new paths do you want to explore? This is just the beginning of your own philosophical adventure.